Jesus left that place and went away to the district of Tyre and Sidon. Just then a Canaanite woman from that region came out and started shouting, "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is tormented by a demon." But he did not answer her at all. And his disciples came and urged him, saying, "Send her away, for she keeps shouting after us." He answered, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." But she came and knelt before him, saying, "Lord, help me." He answered, "It is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." She said, "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." Then Jesus answered her, "Woman, great is your faith. Let it be done for you as you wish." And her daughter was healed instantly. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. We continue in our series of conversations on the differences between evangelical thinking, or the EPC, and the thinking of the PCUSA, or what we've called inclusive theology. I am so tempted every week to review a bunch because it's all connected, and I have to restrain myself, but the problem is if I do that, then I never move on. So just so you know, these sermons, if you would like to review them, are online on our website, and you can listen to them to your heart's content, and then keep up with sort of what we're doing. It's a series that's called Another Way of Seeing. We make a point of saying not the only way of seeing, but another way of seeing. Another legitimate way of seeing. Another legitimate biblical way of seeing. And this is important. It's important to know that that nobody has the full picture or the full story. You see, I'm reviewing already, all right? This is part 2 of the topic of discipleship. We started last week. What does it mean to be a follower of Jesus? And maybe more importantly, how do we live this stuff? How does it move from just good thinking or good ideas in the abstract to a way that it affects us, affects our experience? How do we get it into our living? Last week we talked about faith. What is faith? How does faith work, or trust? And this week we're going to talk about mission or service. Faith or trust is the way we experience God's love within us. Something that God is doing within us. Faith is the way we experience that. We trust it. We live in it. Service is the way we experience and share in God's love beyond us in the world. When we trust the good news, we become bearers of good news. When we trust what God is doing, we become bearers of what God is doing. Just by matter of course. So service is the mechanism through which we proclaim to others that we too have been included, and they too have been included in the broad embrace of a loving God who loves without limitation, without reserve. So here's our distinctive for today. And every week I've been trying to do this and frame it in these distinctives. In the evangelical worldview, service or mission is viewed mostly as the way we bring God to others. Service or mission is viewed mainly as the way we bring God to others. It's called outreach, but it refers to getting people to see things the way I do. It's getting out there and trying to convince others to join up. Missions is me bringing God to them with the goal, ultimate goal, that they will see the light and become like me. This was called, in my growing up years, evangelism. This is what we were doing, convincing others to see things the way I do and believe in it, following it. Now, the presumption for this behavior is the view that the church is the company of God's people. The church is the company of God's people. And those outside the church are not in the company of God's people. No? So the first part's okay. But the second part, is a little distinct. We get a little distinction going on, a little problem, a little difference. The church is where God feels most at home in the evangelical way of thinking, where God feels most comfortable. Not out there in the world, but in here with us among nice people. Right? Going out into the world in service and mission is seen as taking God on the road. We pack him up in our little suitcase and show up to some needy people, open our suitcase, and voila, let God out among them to see what he's going to do. And our effort is to win people over to our way of seeing God. That's mission. We're like the Fuller Brush salesman. We show up, we've got our stuff in our suitcase, we go to the door, and we are trying to get them to buy our vacuum cleaner. I know that's kind of crass, but that's basically the way in which service is often presented. To get them to believe what I believe about God and get them to join in, to sign up. So that's service from an evangelical perspective. There may be humanitarian service, but there's always an ulterior motive of making converts. And acts of kindness are not nearly as important as getting converts to my way of thinking. That's the key. Years ago, I helped begin a mission organization in Honduras with students. And it is still going on. It's about 9 years old. And it's almost entirely run by college students to this day. And we take about 1,000 college students every year to Honduras to work in El Progreso, Honduras. I'm not going to take a lot of time to talk about that, but it's a very exciting work. We started working in this poor village, and a lot has happened over the years. We built a new village of 50 homes, provided fresh water and sanitation, electricity, indoor plumbing, sewage, bilingual school, an orphanage, and much more. And we always have, we've had over the years several churches that have participated in this effort and in this work. But every year I would inevitably have one or two churches decide not to support us, specifically because we had no direct program for making religious converts in Honduras. That we had no program for teaching the Bible or for religious conversion. As if to say, what good is your work if you're not going to recruit? As if nothing else we were doing was significant unless we were doing that. Why, I ask you? Do we always seem to make the automatic assumption that everybody needs to hear how we see it? As if our way of seeing it is somehow better than anybody else's. Why would we think that? Like we have some exact canned answer that's better than anybody else's answer. Why do we assume that our way of thinking is somehow better even if we don't even know what they think yet? It seems to me that service and mission is seen this way, and that service and mission begins to come from a position of superiority and arrogance. I know best what is needed. Okay, so in inclusive PCUSA, how is this different? How is the inclusive theology of the PCUSA different? How do they see mission differently than this? Well, basically, it's this. We would hopefully see that God is present and active not just among us, but in the whole world, as we have already discussed. We would say that God is present and active in the whole world and in all cultures. That the church isn't a private club of those that cut above the rest of humanity because of our beliefs or practices. We're not better humans. Would you agree with that? We're not better humans. We're human. We're human. When we serve, we do so as a fellow human, not a superior human or a special brand of human. And this is how we approach one another. We don't approach others from on high, right? I mean, even Jesus came to dwell among us. But we approach as one of, as a fellow traveler. And secondly, very important, when I serve in the world or among those of other cultures, I'm serving those in whom God is already at work. I don't bring God with me. He is there before I show up. And so my interest is not necessarily in submission to my way of seeing, but conversation and dialogue and understanding, which means that we're very cautious before speaking. We're very cautious because God's already working. We don't want to interrupt that or mess it up or distract from what's going on. In inclusive theology, I don't bring God to anyone or anywhere. God drives his own car. Okay? He takes his own, buys his own plane ticket. I pay attention, I listen, and participate in what God is already doing in you and in whoever we go to. Look at the way Jesus acted when he met people. He didn't have a canned answer for everybody. Listening, paying attention, responding differently to each person depending upon what was there, what was going on. Like faith, service gets me in on what is already happening. So, let's go to this very difficult text. Let's go to this text and see what Jesus is trying to teach his disciples here. It's a very odd story. But what you get from looking at the context of this story is that the disciples are having a hard time fitting Jesus' message in with how they were brought up. And how they were being taught by the Pharisees and the religious leaders of their day. And they weren't happy. They weren't happy with what Jesus was doing, especially when he was reaching out to the tax collectors and the prostitutes and the sinners and the Samaritans and just list the outcasts that he reached out to. They were starting to have a real problem with this practice. So he takes the disciples who are struggling with this whole notion of how it fits in, and he goes up to the area or the region of Tyre and Sidon. It's on the coast. It's modern-day Lebanon. And there they meet a Canaanite woman who comes to them and begins to shout out for mercy. "Lord, have mercy on me. Lord, Son of David, my daughter is being tormented by a demon." And Jesus, interestingly, says nothing. That tips you off a little bit. He says nothing. He just stays quiet. He views this, whether he premeditated it in his knowledge or it just was recorded because it fit in with the topic, whatever. But a Canaanite woman comes to the group. And sure enough, as he sits there quietly and as this woman continues to badger them from the outside, the old beliefs come to the surface. They're confronted with someone who doesn't meet their definition of acceptability, and they're not sure what to do about it. So they don't come to Jesus and say, there's a woman here who needs your help. How come you're not responding? Do they? What do they say? Send her away. She is bothering us. Send her away. My guess is they kind of tried to shoo her away on their own, but she wasn't leaving. So they come to Jesus and say, look, would you please send her away? As a Gentile, she would have been referred to for a long time. This was common knowledge that the Gentiles were unclean. The word dogs is just sort of the common sort of metaphor for the way Gentiles were seen in that day, and along with Samaritans and others who were not part of the Jewish community. And by the way, those from Jerusalem would view the Gentile Jews as not part of the community. So it kind of the circle continued to narrow as you got closer to Jerusalem. By the way, narrow. And when you go that way, pretty soon you're left with just like one person yourself in the circle, and you're kind of tenuous in there, you know. But anyway, this is what was going on. So they asked Jesus to send her away, and he makes this sort of statement that has nothing to do with sending her away. All he says was, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Which is kind of out of context. But the way I view it is, he says that and kind of looks at them. Right? And I think they're saying, well, right. So send her away. You know? Now, one thing you need to know about this. Matthew's book, the Gospel of Matthew, was written primarily to the Jewish community. And we know that in the earliest church there was a problem. And the problem was, how do non-Jews or Gentiles get in on this message? Do you remember that problem? Huh? All right. And the question was, do they need to become Jews first? Do they need to go through the proper channels? Is Jesus to be confined to the institution of Judaism? This was after Jesus was gone. Is Jesus to be confined to the institution of Judaism? And Matthew gives just enough of this event to challenge that sort of typical thinking of the prevailing Jewish exclusivism at that time. And maybe this story was one of the key stories that was used in Acts 15, when they finally determined in the council together in Acts 15 that no, Gentiles do not have to become Jews to follow Jesus. That is huge. That blows the top off the whole thing. So this woman in persistence comes to Jesus, kneels before him as a Gentile, and simply says, Lord, help me. So it's a very tense situation. Jesus says, the prevailing view, I came only for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. The disciples are confused. And she then finally just walks right up to Jesus. Mark has them actually in a house. And she says, Lord, help me. I view that there's a lot of other conversation going on, but Matthew just gets kind of to the point here. And the disciples had to face something. Here was a woman clearly who was responding with a very sincere prayer, and they had to do something about that. God was obviously at work, a Gentile, a non-Jew, calling out to God for mercy. How do we understand that? And notice, Jesus makes no attempt to make her Jewish. And now we come to the statement that has given commentators fits. And I've spent all week just sort of reading them. It's very interesting to read how people try to deal with this statement. It is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. What? That just assaults our sensibilities. What are you talking about? A lot of theories about that statement, by the way. A lot of very interesting theories. Some have actually said, it's kind of an interesting thought, that this story was the way that Jesus first realized that his messiahship was going beyond the walls of Judaism. It's kind of an interesting thought. That there is this sort of learning in Jesus as he moves along in his life, and I do think Jesus learned, but discovering, he was brought up in the traditional kind of Jewish family, and he was raised in the yeshiva as he was trained for a rabbinic school. So he would have been brought up in this kind of exclusivism, and maybe this is the first time that Jesus discovers in the woman's response that, wow, that's right. Look at that faith. Scraps from the master's table. Maybe it's the first. Well, interesting, later on, right after this, he goes out and heals a bunch of people, Gentiles, and he goes and feeds 4,000. And where he's located, it was probably 4,000 Gentiles. The 5,000 were probably Jews. Now he goes out, and I don't know if there's a connection with that. Probably some kind of a connection, but that's kind of an interesting way of looking at it. So, but in my mind, I'm thinking there's another way to look at it. Because I think that Jesus did a lot of that broadening work early on, and so maybe he already knew that. So another commentator said this, which I kind of liked also. If you alter slightly who Jesus is looking at when he makes the statement, the point changes. So if we picture Jesus making this statement with the woman in front of him looking at the disciples, it's not fair to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. The statement becomes kind of a parable or a teaching moment. And if your mind will allow Jesus' eyebrows to raise up a little bit when he says it, then you've got a whole different sort of meaning. As if to say, right? It's a lot harder to be a bigot when you're standing in front of somebody you're avoiding or your bigotry is about. It's a lot harder, isn't it? I can be a bigot from a distance. It's much harder to be so when you're face to face. So these disciples were having a hard time, and now they were face to face. They were face to face. Do you really think that way? Do you really think that it's really not fair? And the interesting thing is, and the reason this story was included, I think, was because of the way the woman responds. That, by the way, they're now silent. They have nothing to say at this statement that Jesus makes. But the woman has a comment. And it may have even surprised Jesus. She says, "But Lord, even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the children's table." Wow. Even the dogs eat the crumbs. It was included to help Matthew's readers understand that God's work isn't just for those in the religious club. How can we serve? How can we do missions without arrogance and superiority? We can remember the Canaanite woman. That's how. Who received mercy from a God who knows no boundaries or limitations. What Jesus finally says to her is, "You're right. You're right. I may have come as Israel's Messiah. I may have come to Israel, but I came for the world." And that's where religious institutions sometimes forget. I may have come to the church as the Messiah. But I came for the world. God will not be limited by institutional superiority. And you know what? We too are members of the same humanity. We don't come as members of the entitled, do we? We don't come as those who are a special cut above those in the world, do we? Don't we come also as fellow beggars, hoping for a scrap falling from the master's table? Don't we come? We don't come leaning on our pedigree or privilege. And when we come looking for scraps, doesn't he always feed us a banquet? When we come seeking mercy, doesn't he respond with love? What did Jesus and the disciples find or discover in the land of the unclean Gentiles? Those who weren't supposed to know anything? He found faith. A faith that was there before he showed up because God was at work first. Wherever and whenever we serve, whether with those close by or far away, God is there first. We go to participate in what he is doing. Our presence brings hope that they or we have not been forgotten. Our service is a service of humility. We are those who are seeking scraps from the master's table, believing that those 12 baskets full that were picked up when he fed the 5,000 and those 7 baskets full that were picked up when he fed the 4,000, that bread goes out into all the world. Nobody is left out. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.